Recently, core PCE has been running around 3.3%. If you measure by CPI, the last print was about 3.8%. Now, that's well above the Fed's target of 2%. Warsh argues that policymakers should focus on the underlying trend rather than reacting to every short-term fluctuation. But there's a problem. The Federal Reserve doesn't ultimately control the long end of the curve. The bond market does. So imagine you're gaining weight every month. You step on the scale and it says you're 30 pounds overweight. You don't like the result. So instead of changing your diet, exercising, or addressing the problem, you start looking for a different scale. Now, that doesn't automatically mean that the new scale is wrong. It might actually be more accurate. But before you trust the new number, you'd probably want to know why you're looking for a new scale in the first place. That is the debate that's happening right now inside the Federal Reserve. The new Fed chairman, Kevin Warsh, wants policymakers to pay more attention to a different measure of inflation, one that currently shows inflation much closer to the Fed's 2% target. And while this isn't the same thing as changing the official inflation calculation, it reminds many people of another moment in history when economists argued that the inflation number was being measured incorrectly. That was the Boskin Commission. And understanding it tells us something important about incentives, economics, and people who control the numbers that we all depend on. So today, the Federal Reserve primarily relies on targets inflation using personal consumption expenditures, or PCE. More specifically, policymakers focus on core PCE. Recently, core PCE has been running around 3.3%. If you measure by CPI, the last print was about 3.8%. Now, that's well above the Fed's target of 2%. But there's another measure called Trimmed Mean PCE, which that measure currently shows inflation much closer at 2.3%. So what's the difference? Trimmed mean inflation systemically removes some of the largest price increases and some of the largest price decreases each month. The theory is straightforward. Not every price movement tells us something meaningful about long-term inflation. Tariffs can create temporary price spikes. Commodity shortages can distort prices. Geopolitical events can distort prices. Temporary shocks can create noise. Warsh argues that policymakers should focus on the underlying trend rather than reacting to every short-term fluctuation. Now, on the surface, that's a reasonable argument. Many economists support measures like the trim measured inflation because they can sometimes provide a clearer signal. But there's also a legitimate concern. The same measure largely underestimated the inflation surge of 2021 when prices were accelerating across the economy, and economists and policymakers believed that inflation would be, quote unquote, transitory. And history proved otherwise, which raises an important question. Are today's inflation pressures temporary distortions, or are they signs of something more persistent? What's interesting is that Kevin Warsh wasn't viewed as a dove coming into this role. Quite the opposite, actually. For years, Warsh was viewed as a hawk, somebody who generally favored tighter monetary policy and higher interest rates when inflation became a problem. He actually repeatedly criticized the Federal Reserve for being too easy, too accommodative, and too willing to inflate financial assets. So if you expected Warsh to come in and aggressively fight inflation, his focus on alternative inflation measures raises an obvious question. Why now? Now, one possible answer is that the environment has changed. Inflation remains well above target, but America's fiscal situation has deteriorated dramatically. The national debt is approaching levels that would have been unimaginable just a generation ago. Annual interest expense is already over $1 trillion, and every percentage point increase in rates makes that burden heavier. The Fed is no longer fighting inflation in a vacuum. It's trying to fight inflation while sitting on top of one of the largest debt burdens in modern history. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying Kevin Warsh is manipulating the data. There's no evidence of that. But what I am saying is that incentives matter. Because if policymakers can point to a measure showing inflation closer to 2.3% instead of 3.3 or 3.8, they have a stronger argument for easing policy, a much stronger argument for cutting rates, and lower rates would immediately reduce pressure on government finances. Again, that doesn't make the measure wrong, but it does mean lower inflation readings have consequences They influence interest rates, government borrowing costs, asset prices, and ultimately the purchasing power of every American. To understand why some people are skeptical, let's go back to the 90s. At the time, inflation was a challenge for Washington. Many government programs were indexed to inflation: Social Security, federal pensions, cost of living adjustments. The higher inflation appeared, the larger these obligations became. So Congress created what became known as the Boskin Commission. The commission was led by economist Michael Boskin, and it was tasked with determining whether the consumer price index accurately measured inflation. After reviewing the data, the commission concluded that CPI overstated inflation by roughly 1 percentage point annually. The argument wasn't that inflation didn't exist. The argument was the methodology exaggerated the rate at which prices were rising. As a result, several methodological changes were introduced: substitution effects, hedonic quality adjustments, geometric weighting, and other technical revisions. Supporters argued these changes improved the accuracy. Critics, on the other hand, argued that they also had another effect. They generally produced lower inflation readings than older methodologies would have produced. And lower inflation readings meant slower growth in government obligations that were tied to inflation. Now, let's assume for a minute that policymakers succeed. Let's assume that the Fed increasingly focuses on measures showing inflation closer to target. And let's just assume that that helps justify lowering interest rate. What happens next? In the short run, lower rates provide relief. The Treasury can refinance debt at lower costs. Financial markets will celebrate. You'll have asset prices rise, and policymakers can argue inflation is under control. But there's a problem. The Federal Reserve doesn't ultimately control the long end of the curve. The bond market does. So when investors buy a 10-year Treasury or a 30-year, they're making a bet on America's future. They're asking one simple question: will I be repaid in dollars that maintain their purchasing power? Or will inflation erode the value of those dollars over time? If investors believe America's fiscal situation is under control, they'll accept the lower yields. But if investors believe deficits will continue to expand, debt will continue growing, and inflation remains a long-term threat, they'll demand higher yields as compensation. And that's why the long end of the Treasury market matters so much. You can change the metric, you can change the narrative, you can justify cutting short-term rates, but if bond investors don't believe the story, long-term yields will rise anyways. And that is where the real danger emerges. Higher yields increase government borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs increase deficits. Larger deficits require more borrowing, and more borrowing can undermine confidence even further. So it's a feedback loop, a debt doom loop. The government issues more debt, interest costs will rise, deficits continue to grow, markets will demand higher yields, and the cycle repeats. At some point, policymakers face increasing pressure to suppress those yields through monetary intervention. In plain English, more money creation, more liquidity into the system, more balance sheet expansion for the Fed, the very policies that helped create many of the problems in the first place. In other words, changing how inflation is discussed may buy time, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem, because the bond market ultimately cares less about the government's preferred inflation metric and more about whether the fiscal math actually works. This is why I believe that the real lesson isn't the Boskin Commission, it isn't Warsh, it's incentives. When inflation is low, nobody debates inflation metrics. But when inflation becomes politically inconvenient or fiscally inconvenient, when it threatens government budgets and debt sustainability, suddenly everyone becomes interested in finding a better way to measure it. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. It doesn't mean economists are actually in bad faith, but incentives do matter. And understanding those incentives matters even more. So here's the question every American should ask. Regardless of what economists call inflation, regardless of which model they prefer, regardless of which metric gets highlighted at the next FOMC meeting, are you actually feeling relief? Is rent becoming more affordable? Are groceries becoming cheaper? Is your insurance cost becoming easier to pay? Healthcare less expensive? Because inflation doesn't exist inside a bunch of intellectuals' preferred calculations. It exists in the real world. A family buying groceries doesn't experience a trim mean. A renter doesn't care what inflation metric that policymakers prefer. A retiree on a fixed income paying insurance premiums doesn't live inside some government model. People experience actual prices, and if the cost of living rises faster than incomes, no amount of statistical sophistication changes that reality. See, the Boskin Commission didn't eliminate inflation. It changed how economists measured it. Now, Kevin Warsh isn't proposing necessarily the same thing today. He's advocating greater attention to a different inflation measure altogether, but the broader pattern feels familiar. When economic problems become difficult to solve, the temptation often is to focus on measuring the problem differently rather than addressing the root cause. Sometimes that may lead to better data. Sometimes it leads to better policy. I would argue that most of the time it's just mathematical wizardry. But citizens should always understand the incentives behind the numbers, because governments can influence statistics, central banks can influence the short end of the curve, but neither can permanently override economic reality. Eventually, the bond market votes. Eventually, purchasing power tells the truth. And whether inflation is reported at 2.3%, 3.3, 3.8, the question that ultimately matters is simple. Can ordinary Americans actually afford better, or at least the same lifestyle that they could before? Because if the answer is no, no amount of statistical wizardry changes the reality that people experience on an everyday basis. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so interesting. Kevin Warsh built much of his reputation as an inflation hawk. That's why investors should pay attention, because when even the hawks begin looking for alternative ways to interpret inflation, it tells you just how difficult America's debt problem may have become. Now, if you found value in the video, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you're interested in more economics, sound money, gold, and the macro trends shaping the future. And let me know in the comments, do you think inflation is actually coming down, or do you think they're just getting better at measuring it? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.